I want to turn to foreign policy because you've called President Trump an idiot for his push to take control of Greenland, and you've said that Congress can't take any chances of allowing that to happen. You've met with the foreign ministers of both Denmark and Greenland this past week. How are they reacting to President Trump's threats?
Look, they're shocked, and they're trying to find reason within what's happening here. And I tried to explain to them there is no reasoning. Right, the president just wants to have a legacy piece where he gets to claim that he brought in this big chunk of land that he sees on the map, even though it's, distorted map. And he's willing to ruin our whole foreign policy, all of our alliances, our economy, just so he could get what he wants. This man is doing everything for himself and nothing for us. Even the idea of buying it, we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars, potentially $500 billion, which is never going to happen.
This kind of political moment rarely arrives with a formal announcement. It tends to surface sideways, through offhand remarks, background briefings, and reactions that seem disproportionate until much later, when the institutional meaning becomes clearer. At first glance, what unfolded during Donald Trump's presidency appeared almost unserious, even absurd to some observers, a throwaway idea that could be dismissed as spectacle rather than strategy. And yet, in American politics, the most consequential signals are often the ones initially laughed away. When reports emerged that Donald Trump had expressed interest in acquiring Greenland, the early reaction followed a familiar script. Jokes came first. Late-night monologues followed. Headlines framed it as a curiosity, a personality-driven distraction in an administration already defined by norm-breaking behavior. The assumption was that this was improvisation, not policy, a remark unmoored from any serious governing framework. At the time, that interpretation felt safe. The United States had not purchased foreign territory in generations. Greenland was not for sale. Denmark, a NATO ally, treated the idea with polite incredulity. And yet what made the moment quietly significant was not whether the purchase was possible, but why the idea surfaced at all, and why it was surfaced from the Oval Office rather than a think tank or academic journal. Greenland has always occupied an unusual place in American strategic thinking. It sits at the crossroads of Arctic shipping lanes, missile defense trajectories, and great power competition that predates Trump by decades. The United States has maintained a military presence there since World War II. Long before Trump, American defense planners understood that as ice melts and Arctic access expands, Greenland's importance only grows. None of this was new. What was new was the way those strategic concerns were translated into language. Rather than framing Greenland through alliances, basing rights, or long-term agreements, Trump approached it through ownership. Transaction, acquisition. The vocabulary mattered. Historically, American expansionist moments have often blended security logic with real estate thinking, from Louisiana to Alaska. Trump's formulation echoed that lineage, but without the careful diplomatic choreography that usually surrounds it. That absence was not accidental. It reflected a broader governing style that treated institutions as obstacles rather than partners. At first, even within Washington, this did not appear decisive. Many officials reportedly assumed the idea would fade once it met resistance. Early interpretations missed the structural meaning. What looked like a failed proposal was also a stress test, probing how far the presidency could push against diplomatic norms without immediate consequence. The refusal from Copenhagen was firm, but restrained. Trump's response, canceling a planned visit to Denmark, escalated the moment from curiosity to signal. That escalation revealed something deeper. The issue was no longer Greenland itself, but the assertion that American power could be exercised unilaterally, even toward allies, if framed as a national interest. Trump did not present the idea as negotiation. He presented it as expectation. And when that expectation was denied, the reaction was punitive rather than conciliatory. This pattern fits within a broader Trump-era redefinition of American leverage. Alliances were treated as transactional arrangements. Sovereignty was respected conditionally. Norms were valuable only insofar as they produced immediate advantage. In that context, Greenland was not an outlier. It was a case study. The Arctic became a stage on which a larger philosophy of power was briefly, almost accidentally, revealed. What initially looked like an impulsive notion began to resemble a diagnostic moment, not because it succeeded, but because it clarified how the administration understood territory, influence, and consent. It suggested a willingness to blur the line between strategic partnership and possession. It also exposed how unprepared existing diplomatic frameworks were for that kind of challenge, especially when it came wrapped in humor and deniability. But what mattered wasn't what was visible at the surface. The jokes, the headlines, the disbelief all obscured a quieter shift in how presidential authority was being asserted. Because moments like this are rarely about a single decision, and they are almost never as simple as they first appear. What followed the initial refusal was not a quiet retreat, but a revealing adjustment. The administration did not walk the idea back. It reframed the rejection as disrespect. That shift mattered. In traditional diplomatic practice, proposals that fail are absorbed into process. They disappear into cables, working groups, and polite silence. This one did not. Instead, the White House treated Denmark's response as a provocation, an inversion of roles that suggested the United States had been wronged by being told no. From that point forward, the episode stopped being about Arctic strategy and became about authority. Trump's decision to cancel his state visit to Denmark was not proportionate to the dispute itself, and that imbalance was precisely the point. The cancellation served as a signal to allies that refusal carried costs, even when refusal was entirely reasonable. In this framework, diplomacy was no longer about mutual consent. It was about leverage and consequence. Inside Washington, this created quiet friction. Career diplomats understood Greenland's status, its autonomous governance, its relationship with Copenhagen, and the sensitivities involved. Defense officials understood the Arctic stakes, but neither group controlled the messaging. The presidency did, and the presidency was communicating something different, that American interest alone could redefine the boundaries of acceptable conversation. At the time, this still didn't feel decisive. Many assumed it was another short-lived controversy, destined to be replaced by the next disruption. Early interpretations again missed structural meaning. What looked like an overreaction was actually a rehearsal. The administration was testing how far it could recast alliance relationships without triggering institutional pushback at home. And notably, there was very little pushback. Congress did not hold hearings. NATO did not issue a formal rebuke. European leaders expressed concern, then moved on. The system absorbed the shock. That absorption may have been the most important outcome of all, because once absorbed, a precedent quietly forms. If a U.S. president can publicly treat allied territory as an object of acquisition and suffer only reputational criticism, then the boundaries of acceptable presidential conduct have shifted. Not legally, but normatively. And norms, once stretched, rarely snap back to their original shape. There was also a domestic dimension that received less attention. Trump's framing of Greenland resonated with a particular vision of American strength, one rooted in expansion, control, and visible dominance. The idea was easy to communicate. You don't need to explain basing agreements or multilateral treaties to sell ownership. Ownership is intuitive. It fits neatly into a worldview where power is measured by what you can take and keep. That simplicity was not accidental. Throughout Trump's presidency, complex international arrangements were often reduced to transactional logic. Trade deficits became losses, alliances became bills, security guarantees became debts. Greenland fit perfectly into that pattern, even if the specifics were implausible. The symbolism did the work. From an institutional perspective, this raised a more unsettling question. If presidential authority could be used to redefine allied relationships rhetorically, what would happen if it were paired with a crisis? Greenland was stable. Denmark was calm. But the method could be applied elsewhere, under more volatile conditions. The episode hinted at how quickly the language of partnership could give way to the language of entitlement. There was also the Arctic itself. While the proposal failed, attention did not disappear. The administration increased its focus on Arctic competition, citing Russia and China's growing presence. Those concerns were valid, shared across administrations. What differed was tone. Instead of reinforcing multilateral frameworks, the emphasis leaned toward unilateral assertion. Greenland became less a partner to engage and more a space to secure. This duality is what makes the episode difficult to dismiss. On one level, it was unserious. On another, it was instructive. It revealed how strategic anxieties, personal governing style, and institutional elasticity converged. It showed how quickly American foreign policy could pivot from consensus-based leadership to pressure-driven assertion without formal policy change. And it left unresolved questions, not about Greenland's future, which remained unchanged, but about America's. About whether alliances were still understood as mutual commitments or merely convenient arrangements. About whether presidential impulse had begun to outrun institutional restraint. About whether the laughter that followed the announcement had masked something more durable taking shape. Because what mattered was not the deal that never happened, but the signal that was sent and received. A signal about how power might be exercised, how refusal might be punished, and how far norms could bend without breaking. And that tension, once introduced, does not simply vanish. It waits for the next moment when conditions are less forgiving. By the time the moment passed, nothing tangible had changed on the map. Greenland remained exactly where it had always been, politically and geographically. And yet the episode lingered inside the machinery of American governance in ways that were easy to underestimate. Because while territory was not acquired, something else had been tested. The elasticity of presidential power when detached from diplomatic tradition. Historically, American foreign policy has relied on a dense web of informal restraints. Not laws, but expectations. Expectations that proposals involving allies would be handled quietly, that sensitive issues of sovereignty would be framed through consultation, that even the most powerful office in the system would signal respect for boundaries that kept alliances intact. What the Greenland episode revealed was how fragile those expectations could be when confronted with a presidency willing to ignore them. This was not about the Arctic alone. It was about method. The suggestion to acquire Greenland did not emerge from a strategic review, a Pentagon white paper, or a congressional mandate. It emerged as an expression of executive instinct. And that distinction matters because instincts, once normalized, can become precedents. Not legal precedents, but behavioral ones. They shape what future presidents believe they can say out loud, what they can test publicly, and what kinds of resistance they are likely to face. The most consequential aspect of the episode may have been how little resistance materialized. There was mockery, certainly. There was diplomatic discomfort. But there was no sustained institutional correction. The system absorbed the shock and moved on. In doing so, it quietly signaled that rhetorical overreach toward allies did not carry meaningful costs, at least not domestically. That lesson does not remain confined to one administration. It enters the bloodstream of political culture. Future leaders observe it. Advisors internalize it. The boundary between seriousness and speculation blurs. And over time, what once seemed unthinkable becomes merely unconventional. There is also a broader historical lens worth considering. American power has always oscillated between cooperation and coercion, between persuasion and dominance. The post-World War II order leaned heavily toward cooperation, especially among allies. The Greenland moment hinted at a different gravitational pull, one where power is asserted through pressure rather than partnership, and where consent is treated as a hurdle rather than a foundation. If that pattern were to continue, the implications would be structural. Allies would begin recalibrating not just policies, but assumptions. They would ask whether American commitments are stable or conditional, whether cooperation is valued intrinsically or only when it aligns with immediate transactional benefit. Over time, that uncertainty would erode trust, even in the absence of overt conflict. The Arctic itself offers a useful metaphor here. As ice recedes, new routes open, new resources become accessible, and new rivalries emerge. The question is not whether competition will increase, but how it will be managed. Through shared frameworks or unilateral claims, through negotiation or assertion. Greenland sat at the center of that question, not because it was for sale, but because it symbolized a choice between those paths. What made the episode unsettling to many observers was not that it failed, but that it felt unfinished. There was no reckoning, no clear reaffirmation of norms, no moment where the system said, explicitly, "This is not how we do things." Instead, the moment faded, unresolved, leaving behind a sense that the boundaries had shifted, even if only slightly, and unresolved shifts have a way of resurfacing. Often not in the same place or with the same actors, but under different conditions, when the stakes are higher and the room for humor is gone. The Greenland proposal may never be repeated in form, but its logic could reappear elsewhere, dressed in different language, aimed at different targets. Because moments like this are rarely about the immediate outcome. They are about what becomes imaginable afterward, about how power is conceived, how allies are regarded, and how much strain democratic institutions can absorb before their shape begins to change. There was no conclusion to the attempt to acquire Greenland, only an echo. And echoes, in politics, tend to travel further than the original sound.